What's going on, guys? Kalamazi here, and this evening I want to talk to you all a bit about the current state of Warlock in what I am assuming is probably one of the final non-release candidate builds of PTR. It is currently Wednesday night. Actually, it's Thursday morning at like 4. There was a vendor build push last night, and I'm still assuming the patch is probably going to be on the 22nd at this point. Sort of waiting to see. Would love some notice, but people have been asking a lot about how is Destro, how is Demo, how is Affliction, is it good, is it bad? What's going on in Mythic Plus and rating, where are all the specs at? So I figured it would be a good idea to make a brief recap video on all the specs, what the tier does. We talked about the tier a little bit already in certain videos and look at certain sims. We're going to cover that briefly and just talk about like the specs, strengths, weaknesses, and the things that could be addressed, changed, some potential buffs, maybe some nerfs, depending what's going on. I know everyone hates the word nerfs, I do too, but I mean, you know, just being realistic here based on certain scenarios and where certain specs are doing good and doing bad. Now, I'm going to look at a few sims in this video, which I actually had in the previous one, just to compare where Destro, Demo, and Aff are at. There'll be links to all those sims down below in the video comment section, pinned there. If I forget them, put a comment, I'll make sure to pin them. Also, at the same time, any weak auras, profiles, or add-ons is here. You can grab them all for free on my Twitch. If you want to swing by or ask any questions anytime, any place, anywhere, feel free to do so. And once again, one huge shout out to my patrons. Thank you guys a million times for all support. There should be a link somewhere up here as well as down in the video description if you're interested in supporting on Patreon. With that being said, let's get into the video, just starting off with, I guess, Destruction first. Alrighty, so Destruction's tier, for those of you who don't know, it's actually pretty cool and probably my favorite tier set out of all the Warlock ones. The 2 set basically every 10 shards you spend, meaning 5 Chaos Bolts or 3 Rain of Fires and some other kind of spell you cast, will give you a charge of Ritual of Ruin. Basically, which is a free Chaos Bolt or Rain of Fire cast. Whenever you cast it, I can sort of try and build into it here as well. You get this large purple Infernal called a Blast from me that comes down for 8 seconds. It does indeed bring Rain of Chaos with it, and it brings a pretty substantial amount of value. And I am playing Rain of Chaos here. You can watch the actual buff right here. We're at 4 stacks here. 6 off this bolt. There's going to be 8 about after this cast here, going right to 10 after this one, and watch my Rain of Fire and my Chaos Bolt. They glow. Watch the Rain of Chaos as well. 8 seconds. Launch the big proc. It extends because the blasphemy is down. It's this big purple Infernal, right? Now, this is obviously pretty OP in hasted settings, Lust, PI, whatever, what have you. And there's also a crazy amount of value at AoE with this actual effect. And the cool thing is you can hold this proc in certain settings. Let's say on a fight like Anduin, where you're going downstairs, spoilers ahead, in Sepulchre, where you want that huge cleave based profile. You can save your big, 8 stack here, or your 10 stack here, I'm sorry. And when you go down with multiple shards, you launch your, free Chaos Bolt, maybe have your player bound Infernal as well for this massive, huge, cleave based window. The main issue with Destruction, there are a couple, right? But the main issue with Destro is that it lacks single target. It lacks in single target. It definitely needs help there. Now, I have sims. This is Demonology. I have sims. Now, ignore the 4-piece stuff here. These are the sims in the previous video that I did. These are double legendary sims. These are single legendary sims. So basically, we're looking at this in the end. But either way, you'll see there's a big disparity here between Destruction and then Affliction and Demonology. Destro baseline at 0 piece, which is 0 tier, no dom shards, roughly 8,308 DPS. Affliction, on the other hand, which is also lacking in single target a bit, this is playing the Malefic Wrath single target legendary, is at basically 9k, and Demonology is sitting at 9.35. Now, if you factor in, 2-piece for Destro, not a huge improvement here because, I mean, the free Chaos Bolt is not a huge deal, right? Every 10 shards. The big thing is the 4-piece, which you can see gives a pretty substantial amount of value, about a 17% DPS increase from the actual 2-piece. And factoring in, the 4-piece double legendary thing here, you're looking at about a 23.2% increase in single target. Now, I've run sims in AoE, and when it comes to AoE, this build is exceptionally strong, playing Reign of Chaos, playing Wilfrid's, playing, the big 2-minute Infernal build. But until you actually get your 4-piece as Destro, chances are pretty high on the single target or 2-target cleave based fights. You're probably still going to end up playing Roaring Blaze and playing Cinders because the 4-piece adds a tremendous amount of value to Wilfrid's and to the 2-minute, big build, because Wilfrid's 2-minute player around Infernals, which means more shard gen, which means more 2-piece procs, which means more blasphemy procs, and it just chains from there. It sort of feels how Reign of Chaos did in alpha and beta of Shadowlands, just one huge cycle of synergy. But until you get there, Roaring Blaze and Cinders is probably still going to be your best bet in single target. into target. Now, like I said, the big thing when it comes to Destro, though, is that just Chaos Bolt and its single target has been lacking for a very long time. Pretty much since actual alpha, which is not like the end of the world, because Destro hasn't been this huge single target powerhouse. But when Destro's lacking in single target, chances are pretty high it's going to be lacking in two target, and the spec is quite literally built around that, with the ability, well, Havoc. I can replicate my Chaos Bolts basically on one target, hit the other, with a 60% damage transfer rate, which can be increased by Duplicitous Havoc, the Conduit, or, you know, the Cloak if you wear it, but nobody wears it because it's garbage. But the big thing is that Destro has been lacking. Chaos Bolt has been buffed multiple times over the course of the expansion, and it's still in a pretty subpar state at this point. Partially, I would assume, due to losing Supremacy, last expansion, Crashing Chaos, other stacking Chaos Bolt damage-based effects, and just the overall nerfs that it received in the first place. So I think there are a few ways that Destro can be addressed when it comes to getting that single target, you know, buff that it needs, which will also translate into more two-target cleave, which would make it relevant on a lot of fights in Sepulchre. Number one, we can just put it Destruction right here. I also can't type for what it's worth, so is that you can just buff Chaos Bolt damage, right? Buff Chaos Bolt damage by a certain amount. I don't think it needs to be like a tremendous amount, like 100% obviously. Keep in mind, smaller buffs when it comes to actual like class tuning, like a 10% buff, a 15% buff is actually really, really big. A 15% buff's pretty wild. Typically you see aura buffs, which are like, you know, a baseline increase to every ability a spec has by 5%. At times, if a class is doing very poorly, you see like a 10% buff. Yeah, they're trying to buff one like exact ability, like Chaos Bolt. You might see something maybe a tiny bit larger if it's one ability like Bolt they're trying to like increase, right? It might be a bit larger than 10%, give or take. Now, in the end, they could buff Chaos Bolt or give, you know, or give the spec an overall aura buff. I mean, realistically, I would rather have an actual Chaos Bolt buff, mainly due to what an aura buff would do to Destro in AoE settings, which we'll get to in a minute here as well. I think a buff to Chaos Bolt would address the single target issue, as well as sort of help address the two target issue with Havoc and things. But another way they could also address the actual Havoc based issue is either increase the transfer rate, the transfer, I can't type, sorry boys, rate of Havoc from 60% to, I don't know, 75% or something along those lines, and or increase the actual duration of Havoc. So it might not be a flat damage buff, like, hey, it's transferring 75% damage instead of, you know, 60, but you have Havoc, let's say, well, let's say it lasts, you know, 14 seconds or 15 seconds, which, you know, might not seem like a whole lot, but that's quite literally an extra Bolt cast, an extra Conflagrate cast, or an extra Incinerate cast, or multiple things under a haste window, or a Power Infusion haste window, or a Decaying Soul Satchel Feel the Blossoms Power Infusion lust window, and it sort of, you know, goes from there. I think it would help, it would bring up Destro a lot when it comes to being just the strong two-target powerhouse that it's, you know, typically been in the past. If Destro is bad this tier, Destro has been essentially unplayable in a progression setting. Not unplayable, but very subpar in a high-end progression raid setting for an entire expansion. Now, I know, hey, listen, we're not Feral Druids. You know, typically Destro's a little better than this. I'm sorry, Feral. I know you were gutted this week. I'm sorry. But I think these are the actual two big changes that that would probably be the best for Destro. Preference to Chaos Bolt here as well. So the reason why, and I want to sort of talk about the buffs and nerfs that might happen to Destro. Buffs here, obviously. The reason why I would prefer a buff to Chaos Bolt is because it addresses, I think, the single target issues, like I said, the Havoc-based issues. In the end, an aura buff would as well. And if Blizzard deems an aura buff worthwhile, that's fine. I'll take it. Not the end of the world. But the thing with Destro, which I don't have the sims here for it, if you look back in my other videos, the Destro 4-piece with the Blasphemy Infernal is a massive DPS gain in 4 target settings. It's like 45%. Like, it's literally like a pretty small amount here, like a 5-6% gain. The 4-piece is like a 45% DPS gain in 4 target settings, because you're playing, whether you're playing Inferno or Cataclysm, it just scales with more and more targets, because more targets to be hit by Inferno, more shard gen, it just spirals out of control to the point where like all you're really doing is casting Rain of Fire. I don't think I even have any drums on me, but I can try and do it here. It gets to the point where all you're casting is just Rain of Fire. And if you're chaining blasphemies, the thing that happens here is if you summon a blasphemy, the 4-piece proc, while one is down, it will do this like large pulsing AoE and stun the mob. So it chains these stuns forever, and this pack is like just permanently stunned and permanently at a point where like you don't have to do anything to it because you're just chaining so much value. Even if the stun was removed, I'm fine with it. It's cool, but I do think the actual AoE that it brings is quite possibly something that Blizzard would look at maybe addressing, just because, like I said, it's just so much AoE, right? You can get things rolling. Hopefully get a proc or two here, maybe. Not even getting a single Rain of Chaos proc, nothing. There's one, here's my tier bonus, 3 Rain of Fires. And this is actually a pretty poor opener for what it's worth. You can just chain this value infinitely. There's another tier proc. You can see the partial charging coming in from the actual Blasphemy Infernals. And look at my Rain of Chaos window here too. I'm at 20 seconds left here. It's pretty wild the value you can get. This is like a pretty bad, I guess, opener here. We pretty much didn't get any procs as far as Rain of Chaos went early on, which if you get those procs, it spirals even more into more Blasphemy procs early on, because more Rain of Chaos Infernals, more shards. So I wouldn't be surprised if Blizz addressed this in some way, but my big concern is that Blizz goes, oh, it's too strong, make it every 16 shards or something, and some kind of like just uncoordinated, illogical nerf because they don't know how to tune the tier set, right? Now, I assume they do. I assume that they understand how the tier set works, but realistically, a better way, if they're going to nerf the AoE, because there's more and more talk about Destro AoE with Frost Mages getting nerfed lately and things like that, I feel a better way to nerf the actual AoE. You can try and nerf Rain of Fire, you can do what you want, but Destro's had this insane AoE profile. You've seen it in the MDI. It's had this insane AoE profile since literal alpha of the expansion. It's sort of exacerbated when it comes to having the 4-piece and just chaining it over and over and over, faster and faster and faster. I think what they could do is potentially, if need be, either add an internal cooldown on the Blasphemy stun. This is the actual damage here from the Infernal. By the way, if you chain like one Blasphemy proc into the other, it's pretty small here. Terrible opener and 3 targets. Throw in 5-6 targets, you're zooming. All you're spamming is Rain of Fire. There's clips in the channel of it, right? They could put an ICD on the actual stun, and realistically, they probably could just nerf the actual Immolation Aura damage the Blasphemy does, right? I don't want them hitting the actual 2-piece because it also indirectly affects, if it's a targeted AoE nerf, it directly, I guess, affects the single target damage that it puts out too, which would go from being, what, 19, 20-ish% of an increase to probably significantly less, and it would make the actual 2-piece feel much less exciting when it comes to a rating setting, a plus setting, whatever, what have you. Destro has a lot of potential when it comes to the tier set, and it's the one that I'm most excited about going into 9.2. Holding these procs for certain large pulls, building a proc in the previous pack, heading into the next one, it's really wild. But in the end, Destro single target and 2 target needs a buff. And the AoE, if it's going to get nerfed at some point, which it might, buckle up, I'm not calling for it, just saying, I hope they nerf the right thing and not just the baseline shard count. Because if they do, it's going to be pretty miserable. Oh yeah, buff Chaos Bolt, and you can probably mess with Havoc a little bit too, because Havoc needs some help as well. I sort of forgot to add at the end of that Destro bit, I think Destro can be pretty good in Mythic Plus and heavy AoE settings with it being in the current format it's in. When it comes to rating, like I said, though, barring it being a heavy AoE setting, which is like on the first boss, and the first boss is going to fall over, you can play with your toes in that boss, it needs help in single target and 2 target to be relevant. There are a few fights in this raid which are probably prime Destro fights, and it might be played there just due to the sheer fact that it's such a good fight for it, like Pantheon is for Ath. It could be good for Destro too, even with it being in that bad of a shape. But for the Spec to be actually competitive and realistic, it needs some Chaos Bolt buffs or some kind of single target buffs, and probably some love in the actual Havoc area as well. So I'm not crazy high on Destro for this tier in its current form, tuning wise. Mythic Plus wise, though, seems to be pretty decent. We'll see where it goes. Affliction. So the Affliction 2-piece, put it on here and actually find my other piece of gear. The Affliction 2-piece basically says, there we go. There we go. Rapture's damage baseline increased by 15%. And every Rapture you cast extends the duration of Corruption, Agony, and UA By 2 seconds. So number one, this feeds into more of a filler kind of playstyle, more time to cast your Drain Souls or your Shadow Bolts, more leeway with Malefic Wrath, the legendary playing single target. And the 4-piece, when Agony, Corruption, and UA are active, they don't have to be active on the same target. When there is one iteration of Agony, Corruption, and UA anywhere, your Drain Soul has a 10% chance, or Shadow Bolt has a higher chance, to make your next Malefic Rapture cost no soul shards and cast instantly. Now, they added a clause to the 2-piece here as well, which is not seen. If you're playing Absolute Corruption, the talent, whenever you rapture, it does like a tick of Absolute Corruption damage, or of Corruption damage. So it sort of adds like a bit of a damage modifier in there, because, hey, you're not really getting the extension because it's permanent, right? So the AF bonus overall is the least powerful going to Sims here. Baseline, we're looking at, about a 5.5% DPS increase with the 2-set, and about 11.5% with the actual 4-piece. And this is the Malefic Wrath Sim here, with double legendaries on, right? I will say right now, I don't have the Necrolord Sims here. Necrolord Affliction with Shard of Annihilation versus DSS. Sims about 1,000 DPS higher than this, mainly because of the insane execute synergy with Shard of Annihilation, Drain Soul, Malefic Wrath, your legendary, Withering Bolt, just Drain Soul baseline damage amps, and things like that. But it also means you're not playing Night Fae. Not playing Night Fae is, well, soul shape, right? So there might be a few fights this tier. Maybe it's relevant, but honestly, like, AF is still at a point where it's it's under-tuned a bit as well. I mean, it's still less than what Demonology does in single target. Even with the actual big Necrolord Malefic Wrath build, it's still behind it by a few hundred DPS, which, I don't think Demonology is too OP. Spoilers ahead, but we'll get to that. So, now, the big thing here, obviously 2-piece, 4-piece overall not as powerful as far as raw percent increases go. I don't think it's required though. I don't think a tier set needs to be 20% for the 4-piece, 7% at least for the 2, or it's bad, right? It sort of depends just where the class falls overall, tuning wise. I'd say the Affliction 2-piece, 4-piece is the one that people probably don't like the most, because number one, there's no relevancy in Mythic Plus if you're playing Sow the Seeds. It only counts towards Malefic Rapture. It doesn't count towards, Seed of Corruption spam if you're playing STS, right? Now, I have played some builds with like Vile Taint and AC Mythic Plus for the 2-piece bonus here, as well as like, the Rapture damage, playing Vile Taint over Sow the Seeds, and it doesn't seem terrible. I want to play with it a bit more, but it sort of feels like how it was in 9.0, where like people are running in and just hitting one button and spinning and killing everything, like a Windwalker or a Warrior, and I'm going in there at Precast Seed, UA, Agony, 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 Vile Taint. Like the whole pack's dead at that point, man. That's one of the reasons that why Seed spam was so good. You had that snap on demand burst profile. Now, I'm not saying that build's bad. The Vile Taint AC build, and it might end up being played in Plus. But I really wish, I talked about it a bit before, the number one thing for AF, I would love to see have the 4-piece also grant a proc of Seed of Corruption, which would indeed be affected by Sow the Seeds, if you're playing a talent, right, obviously, because otherwise, if you're playing a Sow the Seeds build Mythic Plus, that Rapture proc, it's still semi-relevant. Hey, I probably still have an Agony up and a Corruption up, but I'm not playing Vile Taint, I'm not playing any other dot-based kind of effects, right? It doesn't really give you the same value as a Sow the Seeds proc would be, right? Plus, I mean, typically and the bigger thing here is typically I'm only really casting Drain Souls for the 4-piece to proc it when a pack is nearly dead and I'm shard sniping for the next pack. And that makes things sort of awkward in the first place, but that's just sort of a world we live in, right? I don't really know what else to say about that. Number two is that sort of plays into what we just talked about. People have mentioned that in like heavy council-based settings, that the 4-piece is a bit hard to actually get value out of because of, we're casting more dots, we're refreshing more agonies, or we're playing Siphon Life in 2-target settings, or whatever, what have you. In council-based fights, there's not as much time to cast Drain Souls and Shadow Bolts. Now, there is a bit of merit to that. I feel like there's sort of like both ends of the spectrum where like I've played with it and I felt that with certain builds, and with others I haven't, right? Like I played a Nightfall AC build, for example. I had all day to cast Shadow Bolts, right? I had AC up, I had Nightfall procs coming in from more Corruptions being active, which fed more 4-piece procs. And then at the same time in Plus, I felt it on, these trash packs where, yeah, it doesn't really seem relevant at all because there's no seed value, and just in general, even if there was, I'm not really casting many Drain Souls in the first place, right? So the other suggestion here would be to shift the 4-piece proc to Unstable Affliction. Now, this has also been mentioned for a while, Unstable Affliction and not Drain Solar Shadow Bolt. Now, this has also been mentioned for a while. At this point, I don't think we're getting any tier tuning or changes because we're so far into the patch. Wishful thinking, but I mean, UA is a 1 dot limit basically in every setting, barring PvP. Just tune it somehow. You can cap it, you can figure it out, I don't know. But there's always a 1 target limit in PvE, which means you have the same proc rate in a 1 target fight or a 1 million target fight. But in a 1 million target fight, you're just refreshing dots. In a 1 target fight, you have a lot more time to cast Drain Souls and Shadow Bolts. So there's sort of an in-between there, give or take. I don't really expect a whole lot of tier set tuning in the first place, but hey, if it happens, right? So the thing outside of the actual tier set changes for Affliction, which I'm hoping for, is that I do think Affliction still feels a little bit subpar when it comes to raw damage, whether it's in like single target playing Malefic Wrath, or whether you're in like, you know, I guess council-based settings, right? And I think a lot of that actually stems back to the Malefic Rapture nerfs in 9.1, when they nerfed Malefic Rapture, as well as nerfing Focus Malignancy, and also, you know, essentially removing Shadow's Embrace and making it a talent, is a free proc there, and giving us Darkcaller baseline. Now, I think having Darkcaller baseline in a 2-minute, you know, damage profile is good, and in the end, I would typically take 9 times out of 10 when it comes to like class changes and tuning in the middle of a patch. I will take a better damage profile. Like, let me rephrase that. A better toolkit, like 2-minute Dark Lair with 2-minute Dark Soul. We all remember the days of Castle Nathria where we had to play, you know, 3-minute Dark Lair, 2-minute Dark Soul, and it felt terrible. Nobody wanted to play that. This weird cooldown desyncing wasn't very fun, right? Because in the middle of expansions, you typically don't see large changes made like that. You normally see them, you know, in a new expansion or in a pre-patch. So typically I would prefer, you know, they change the actual toolkit, right? Because they can just adjust numbers. They can tune things if the class is undertuned. Hey, buff it. Something scuffed, you know, you can fix it by just, you know, raw numbers tuning, right? But that never came for Affliction. We got the 2-minute build, and then we were still left out back in the dumpster, you know, for, I don't know, 8 months now, give or take. I do get that AF was pretty good in Castle Nathria. I get that. I understand. But Affliction, barring decaying Soul Satchel Cleave in like certain fights in SOD, like where you can get the big value, has just been nowhere near as good. And I feel like that's mainly because of the Rapture nerfs on top of the Malignancy nerfs, and also the removal of Shadow's Embrace. Because Shadow's Embrace was a baseline, I think, 9% damage increase without the Cold Embrace conduit, which we played in every setting. So that made it, you know, an 11.5% DPS increase, which is pretty big in single target. A trade-off for a 2-minute Dark Lair, when Dark Lair does quite literally how much of my damage? It did 4%. That's not an equal trade-off. Plus they gutted Rapture and gutted Malignancy. So, if there's going to be one change to Affliction, I wouldn't mind the dot damage buff. But I think the most realistic thing is to honestly just revert the Malefic Rapture changes that came in 9.1. And they might have to tune more around that, buff them a bit more, maybe not give the full value back. But I think it would go a long way in making Affliction more relevant. I know Rapture scaling in certain fights can be a little sketchy, a bit awkward. So just, it is what it is, right? But I think it's a great place to start, because obviously dot damage has been touched a little bit. I think Blizz is pretty scared to touch it in the first place. And yeah, so the 2-piece and the 2-piece / 4-piece is not incredibly relevant in Mythic Plus unless you're playing a Vile Taint build. And when it comes to Mythic Plus in generalist here, AF with Sow the Seeds is still fine. It's still solid, but it lacks in single target a tremendous amount, because we're losing Dagger and Necrotic Wounds, the Enema trait. And honestly, I mean, it doesn't really have a 4-piece in Mythic Plus if you're playing Sow the Seeds. If you're playing a Vile Taint, Absolute Corruption, Rapture build, okay, it has a 2-piece and a 4-piece, but I don't know if the damage is there, even playing Wrath Consumption, as much as people think it is. Destro and Demo have gained a lot of ground in Mythic Plus, and Affliction has a lot to live up to this patch in Plus. I don't know if it does as much as it did in 9.1. In the raid, it could be a really good AF tier. There are a lot of fights that could be really good for Affliction, like Pantheon. Other ones obviously too, like single target fights. There's a lot of potential, but if AF is in the format it's in right now, it probably won't be played probably really at all in the raid, barring 1 or 2 fights, just due to how undertuned it is, I think, comparatively to other specs and other options that Warlock has. So, with that being said, let's get into the final spec, Demonology. So, if we're looking at Demonology, off the bat, it is probably going, at this current point in time, what is today? I don't know. February 10th at 5 in the morning, it is probably going to be the most played spec in the raid. But out of Warlock, not out of everybody, out of Warlock. I think that's mostly due to the fact, like I said, Destro and Aff are just undertuned. This overall, I think, is a better Destro Aff raid than it is Demonology, because they both have unique and different niche kind of profiles they bring. Destro brings good 2 target based cleave, Aff can bring good council based cleave, and Demonology can bring good single target damage, right? And also good stat cleave. But the whole raid's not single target based, even though single target damage is pretty relevant. Some fights are a bit mediocre and wishy-washy for Demonology, but you play it there because Destro and Aff are just so bad in those fights because they haven't tuned them since, you know, Alpha and Beta. Now, okay, jokes aside, I think Destro's the best spec overall in the raid for Warlocks, but I don't think it's actually too OP. Now, looking at the Sims here, 0 piece, I'll go relative DPS here, 2 piece is strong. The Demo 2 piece is strong. It gives you a 3rd Dreadstalker, which, if you guys don't know, Dreadstalkers is right here. It is a 20-second cooldown, which just you cast 2 dogs, basically. It's strong. There's a lot of synergy with Dreadlash, with FTS, with Carnivore Stalkers, the Conduit. It's a pretty synergistic build. The 3rd dog pushes certain talents ahead of others that we've seen in 9.1. For example, FTS from the Shadows is more or less going to be most likely our single target option, best one, when it comes to playing the Decon build in 9.2. Now, there's been a lot of talk about this 2-piece because it is one of the stronger ones, being an 11.5 DPS increase. It's strong in single target, it's strong in 2 target, it's strong in Mythic Plus, it's strong in AoE. I really, really, really hope that they just keep the dog at 100%. They did indeed buff I think Dreadbite, yeah, the baseline damage of Dreadbite going into 9.1. Realistically, I don't want them to nerf Dreadbite or anything at all, but if they do, I think looking at Dreadbite's overall damage is probably going to be their most likely direction of doing that, because unless they want to nerf the tier. But making the tier a 1 in 2 proc, you know, a 30% chance to proc, a 1 in 3 chance, is going to make things pretty miserable. Number 1, because hey, it removes a lot of the fun, right? Number 2, it's RNG. And number 3, that 3rd dog counts towards demonic consumption. And Demonology already has enough issues, or I guess, you know, RNG with demonic consumption and weird stamina scaling and power infusions and all that. So my number 1 hope is that if they do try to tune the 2-piece, they don't touch the 3rd dog and make it a % chance. Leave it at 100%. If you're going to nerf something, maybe hit Dreadbite. Look at something along those lines. Now, the 4-piece is also a pretty decent DPS increase. It is finally now fixed on PTR. This is the first build that's been working since, you know, the 4-piece for Demonology has been bugged since the very first build of PTR. And some of the videos I've watched and people have talked about at raid testing, oh yeah, Demo Lock looks OP, because you saw a 4-piece that was doing 5 to 6% more damage overall than it should have been doing. Now, Demonology probably is it probably is the strongest single target spec in the game now, but that's all it can do. It does that and stat cleave, so it shouldn't be like, you know, necessarily as bad as Aff or Destro, even though they need buffs in the first place. The 4-piece is strong. This is the first PTR build where it's actually been working. It's been bugged and gone to a worse and worse state until right now. It's working now. It's good. And this sim accurately reflects what the 4-piece is, right? Now, gaining your 2nd legendary here, it pushes Demonology up, what, another 3.5%, give or take. And overall, it's just fine. It's Demonology. It does what it does. You pretty much do the same thing. You cast your Grimoire, you cast your dogs, you cast your imps. The main thing that's changed with Demonology is that, like I said, you're playing FTS, realistically, most likely, over Vile Fiend this tier, because FTS from the Shadows, this debuff here, increases Tyrant damage, as well as, you know, Demon Bolt damage, Hand of Ghoulban splash damage, and things like that. Now, there's still a bit of, like, debate on the Soul Conduit versus Grimoire Filagard thing, with, you know, playing Wilfred's legendary versus the dog legendary. We'll figure that out, you know, a bit later on down the line. The only other change besides that is, realistically, you're probably just playing Dreamweaver in every setting. And to be honest, she's simmed better by a substantial margin for months now. It's just, we didn't have Decaying, we didn't have the double legendaries, obviously. We didn't have Dream Delver when SOD first came out. And we really didn't have her full effect. Now, Nia does have that weird half-a-minute growth invigoration ability, which is tied to Soul Rot, which gives you that stamina increase for half a minute, and that rolling mastery for half a minute, right? But Dreamweaver is strong in the first place because of Soul Rot with Field of Blossoms. When you have your Tyrant going, for example, we can set one up right here. When you have your Tyrant rolling, I can hit my dogs in here. I can get these bolts casting and rip this big Tyrant off. With Nia, you cast your Soul Rot before your Tyrant. With Dreamweaver, it's after, to get that full haste amp rolling into your Tyrant, which receives the haste amp and gets more cast off. It's more powerful at that point in time. Nia before, Dreamweaver after. When we get double legendaries with Decaying Soul Satchel as Night Phase, you're playing that, you also have that Field of Blossoms multiplicative haste stacking effect with the additive crit effect from the legendary itself. So it adds even more power, more funnel in a sense to your Tyrant. So besides that, Demonology is still basically the same as it was before. You cast your Tyrants, you cast your Dogs, you cast your Imps, and that's more or less life. But Demonology doesn't have the reach of Destro and Ath. Demonology is not going to be able to hit these two targets here. You choose one, and that's it. There's no dog cleave here. There's no weird, oh, I can implode this one. No, you hit one, and that's it. Destro and Ath have the reach, right? Which, a lot of fights, this tier, that reach is solid, and it's warranted, and it can be really good. But with Destro and Ath being so undertuned, Demonology has sort of been the de facto, go-to kind of, I guess the go-to spec, more or less, when it comes to testing. So, now, Warlock hasn't received a whole lot of tuning changes at all since, like, a month. Honestly, it's been a long time. They've been nerfing other classes more and more and more, which has, increased Warlock value over the past few weeks or so. They've nerfed mages, boomkins. They've nerfed basically every class, and Warlock hasn't been touched. So I'm not really sure if that's like a sort of Damocles looming kind of thing, or just like, hey, maybe Warlock is in a spot that they sort of want to tune around, give or take, like the certain damage breakpoint, give or take. Demonology, I don't think really needs a whole lot of changes. Like, it's solid. The third dog gives you 3 demonic core procs. You can get off these 11 imp tyrants versus the 9 imp ones much easier now than you could before. It's just solid. It feels much better too, not having to worry about vile fiends and things. You don't scuff tyrants anywhere near as often. Dreamweaver Field of Blossoms play feels a lot better, especially if they're having it around for a patch. There's no more of this weird, oh, drop my field and have to move out of it because I'm an idiot, right? You're more used to playing with it. I'm much more excited to play Demonology this tier if we do end up playing it. My fear is that once again Blizzard sees something they don't like and just nerfs it into the ground. But then again, Aph's had its tier in Castle. Demonology has had its tier in Sanctum. So I guess that technically means that Destro's up for a tier in Sepulchre. And like I said, out of all 3 tier bonuses, Destro's the most fun. So as far as Mythic Plus is concerned, though, for Demonology, the third dog has made a pretty big difference, because you can play this FTS Dreadlash build, the big dogs build, with Soul Conduit or Grimoire for more single target damage, and that third dog means higher FTS uptime. When they rechomp, more damage. It's just solid. It's made the build even more synergistic. It feels like one big just circle of synergy. It's really solid. It's really cool. I give it a pretty good grade in Mythic Plus. It's not like up there with the the ranks of destruction, dropping 1 million infernals and doing 1 million damage. But it's solid. It brings good single targets. It brings good AoE, whether you're playing Wilfrids or Grim Inquisitors. And in the raid, it's probably going to be our best spec at this point in time, barring class tuning. So hopefully you're a Demonology fan heading into 9.2 at this point. Yep, thanks for watching, guys. I hope this video, I guess, gave y'all a better understanding of Warlock and where it currently sits at this late point in 9.2 PTR. There was a vendor build push today, so I mean, there could be another tuning build tomorrow. Tomorrow's build could literally be a release candidate. I don't know, but at this current point in time, I mean, Destro and Demo have gained more ground in Mythic Plus comparatively this tier than Affliction has. The raid overall, probably Demonology, followed by probably like Ath, maybe like an even ground of like Ath and Destro, but they're definitely a notch or two below Demonology as far as like the raw damage and overall playability is in a high-end prog setting. Destro tier, a lot of fun. My favorite, probably followed by Demonology and then Affliction. Destro looks pretty good in +2. Ath still has some of the seeds build if you want it, albeit not really affected by the 2-piece, 4-piece, but we'll see where that goes. Overall, it's still hard to say where Warlock is going to land because class tuning is still here. That sort of Damocles is still sitting over our heads with no Warlock changes in literal weeks or probably months at this point, barring the tier being changed a little bit. No tuning, but we'll see where that goes. If things change, I'll make a video to update you guys. I know this might have been a bit of a long one, but people wanted an update on the specs and where things lie, and yeah, I hope you guys got it. So let me know what you guys think of I guess the overall spec analysis and the state of Warlock in the comment section below. Any questions, drop them down there as well. I'll be sure to get back to you. Any weak auras, profiles, or add-ons you saw here, once again, all for free on my Twitch. Want to swing by, hang out, grab them. Ask any questions anytime, feel free to do so. And also, one big final massive shout out to all my patrons. Thank you guys a million times for all support. If you're looking at supporting, there should be a link somewhere up here as well as down in the video description below. Thanks again for watching, dudes. Much love, and I will talk to you all again soon on stream. Peace.